Started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music's free, virtual, and very informal monthly lecture series, Conversations with Our Curator. I am Melissa Ziobro, the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music here at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. Tonight we are chatting with Chris Payne. Chris is a journalist whose writing has appeared in publications like Vulture, Stereogum, Alternative Press, and Billboard, where he spent 7 years as a staff writer and podcast host covering alternative and independent music. He was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and grew up in the state. Although he now lives in Brooklyn, we will forgive him for that. We are here tonight to discuss Chris's book, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008. But before we dive into chatting with Chris, just a few housekeeping details. Again, apologies to our regulars who hear this every month, but we always have new people on these Zooms, and I love that. And it is my job to spread the word of the good works we are doing here at the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music. So bear with me for just 2 minutes. If you're not super familiar with us, we just had a little name tweak actually from the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music to the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music. It's a little streamlined, and we think it helps emphasize our work as a custodian of American music history broadly. We are Bruce's official repository, it's true, but we seek to tell broader stories about American life, history, and culture through music in a variety of genres and forms with our programming, our exhibits, our publications, and more. So, yes, Bruce's official repository, but not just about Bruce. As a longtime history professor here at Monmouth, I've been teaching history since 2007. I really get excited about the fact that music is such an accessible prism through which we can explore our shared past. So, lots of exciting things going on at the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music. Perhaps most importantly, the fact that we are close to opening our new home, a roughly 30,000 square foot facility that will include a close to 240 seat theater, some 10,000 square feet of exhibits, and yes, the archive for research. So you can watch a live cam of the building stream. You can see our calendar of events. You can donate because we are a 501c3, all on our website, which is springsteencenter.org. I will put our link tree in the chat in just a moment so you can connect with us either on the website or across our various social media channels. So thank you for letting me just introduce us to you for a moment since, as I said, we always have new names on the registration list month to month. So back to tonight's program, Conversations with Our Curator, again, is this free monthly web series that features researchers and writers who are exploring new perspectives in American music history. The idea is free programming for everybody, wherever they are, even if they can't come to the beautiful Jersey Shore. So after some initial questions from me, we will then open the floor to audience Q&A. And as I was joking at the beginning, I'm very punctual, so we keep these events to no more than 1 hour. If you enjoy tonight's program, of course, I want you to go out and buy the book. And then if you want to tell anybody about the program, the recording will live on our website. I just posted the books for the first half of 2026, so very, very excited about all the reading and chatting we have to do together in the new year. All right, so I will stop yapping now and we'll get to Chris. So, Chris, we at the Springsteen Center for American Music cover all types of music. As I noted, it's not just about Bruce, but a lot of our audience currently skews towards like a more classic rock fandom. So, how would you define emo for anyone who's here to learn something new tonight and not necessarily a fan?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Melissa. So thank you so much for having me. The program that you have going on is so cool, so vital. And thank you everyone for joining me because, thank you for joining me after work, spending time with us, whatever it was you had going on today. Thanks for joining. Defining emo, I was probably sharper with this when I was doing tons of interviews like the week the book came out, but I'll do my best. Emo is like a vein of punk rock that comes from hardcore, which is a vein of punk rock that's known for really in your face, loud, violent performances. But emo is a strain of hardcore punk that is especially either emotional, as the name suggests, especially performative, or even just over the top with whatever it is. There's many definitions of emo, but I think emotional, over the top, exuberant, maybe performative, just a spectacle. And coming from hardcore punk in some way is how I would best describe the great genre of emo, which we're talking about.
And why the years 1999 to 2008 specifically when you were scoping the book?
Yeah, so emo's been around since the mid 80s. It started from the hardcore punk scene in Washington, D.C. And it grew throughout the late 80s into the 90s. It spread across America in the 90s and took on, became a little bit more accessible, took on some sounds from indie rock and college rock in the 90s. And then at the tail end of the 90s, kind of like the way people talk about Seattle with grunge and Nirvana in the early 90s, the late 90s was when emo exploded into the mainstream. And that's what my book is about, the oral history of emo's mainstream explosion. And as luck would have it, this was really my big musical awakening because I grew up in New Jersey in a town called Colonia in central Jersey in Woodbridge Township. And this music was absolutely huge where I grew up in my high school. It was really just like my big musical awakening, like being around this stuff, like My Chemical Romance, probably the biggest band to come out of the scene is from New Jersey, from northern New Jersey. And once bands like them hit it big, bands also before them like Thursday, Jimmy Eat World, Dashboard Confessional. I went to high school between the years of 2002 and 2006, and there were so many bands in my high school. It was such a vibrant, exciting scene. Like my buddy Greg Scalera, still one of my good friends. He played synthesizers in a band, like a local band who almost signed to a record label and played with Paramore when they were coming up. So I like heard Paramore's early songs when barely anyone else heard them, just because like I had friends, everyone had friends. Like it was just sort of like common in my high school. Just like the scene was popping so much back then, and it really goes back to those like punk and hardcore roots that really gave the scene a heart and a soul. Some of that was lost as the music got so big, but also as the music got so big between 99 and '08, there's some great stories in there as it rubbed shoulders with pop and hip hop and things like the TRL and the VMAs and MTV and its peak and the Grammys. There's some scenes in this book. Some of my favorite scenes from this book are when these like punk rock outcasts are hanging out at the Grammys and the VMAs. So it was a scene that no one really expected, this emo scene. No one expected it to get as big as it did on MTV and the Grammys and the mainstream, but it did for almost a decade, and that's what the book's about.
I think that a lot of American music movements are born kind of in tension with the mainstream and then absorbed by it, right? And we see a lot of
Mm.
artists personally struggle with that. Like they want the success and then they get it and they're worried about having sold out. What does emo's essentially rapid mainstreaming tell us about American culture in the early 2000s?
I feel like, well, in rock music, everyone was like looking for the next big thing, like after Nirvana, after like the tragic loss of Kurt Cobain, and like, grunge has already started to peter out by then. There was this period where like, what's the next big thing was going to be? For some people, it was garage rock bands in New York City, like downtown bands like the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and that scene. For some people, it was like new metal, stuff like Korn and Slipknot, and uh, so there had always been this excitement. You could probably trace it back to the Beatles or Elvis of in rock and roll. What's the next big sound? Like, what's the next Beatles, or what's the next big thing? And like you said, Melissa, the push and pull of the underground is so central to this because I think, people who care, they always look to the underground because there's like ethos and a purity that comes from that. And like for the next big thing, they want it to be something that stands for something. And in this moment in time, that thing was emo. And it's interesting because like some some genres were hyped up to maybe be that, and it totally didn't happen, or maybe it happened for half a minute and then teetered out. Some genres, like something like shoegaze, it never happened, but it still has this mystique today because it never got popular, it never got embarrassing. Because sometimes when things get really popular, they get really embarrassing too. But yeah, emo is a lot of the reason why I like put so much of my life into writing a book about this music is because even with getting so popular and what comes with that of going commercial and like losing some of your underground ethos, it emo music meant so much in the end and still means so much, which is like I went to go see My Chemical Romance play MetLife Stadium in Jersey last summer, and it was like, I don't say this lightly, it was maybe the best concert I've ever been to. And like seeing how many such a diverse group of like, young people there. Like, I'm 37 and I'm like the prime age for someone who came up with MCR. And honestly, it was at least 50-50, but like probably more Gen Z kids at the MCR show. And it's been that way for all their reunion shows since they got back together. So like, it's really special that like mainstream emo, all different waves of emo because there's, stuff that came after with the stuff in my book, but all different waves of emo have meant a lot. But it's really touching to me that like as the years pass, the mainstream era, like it kind of in a lot of ways, especially with a band like MCR, maintained the heart and soul of both, the underground and once it got big.
Your comments about, looking for the next big thing, I think that's with every genre and every era, right? For the Bruce fans, the hardcore Bruce fans who might be here today learning something new, think about Springsteen being called the new Dylan. And he's like, hey, hold on,
Mm.
like the original Dylan is still around and he's okay. Like, always looking for the next big thing. Your book emphasizes a lot of regional scenes. So, like New Jersey, Long Island, Chicago, I think the Midwest. How did geography shape emo's sound and values, even as it becomes national?
Yeah, so the book, as we were talking about, Melissa, the book starts in 1999. There's a little bit of lead up. Most of it is in Jersey, the early stuff, but the book
I
starts in
know I want to
1999.
keep making it about Jersey, but I'm trying not to make, we'll get more Jersey specific in a little bit.
Yeah, so this is, the internet exists in 1999, and the internet is important in a lot of underground spaces like punk rock. But the internet obviously is not what it is today. Like social media doesn't really exist in the way it does now. There's no music or video streaming really. It's still mostly for, it's for like very online kind of like countercultural people. It's a special interest kind of thing, right? So the years like of like the late 90s when the book starts was right before the internet took that big leap, when things were still kind of in a prior era. It was like the very end of something. It sounds like I'm about to start talking about like before people were always staring at their phones or something. But with your question about geography, because everyone wasn't so easily connected on the World Wide Web yet, uh the intimacy of these scenes and like the in-personness of these scenes was so important because they weren't as connected they are now. So like s- such vibrant identities unique to the certain scenes would come out. Where like the Long Island scene had a little bit more of a swagger and like a hip hop feel to it than other scenes. Um, you know, the Midwest was like, or Chicago especially, where we start, because like the origins of Fall Out Boy came out of the Chicago hardcore scene. That scene was just like so intense and so hyper left-wing political, and also just so small. The scene that like people like Pete Wentz came out of, it's super interesting. New Jersey was kind of like the connector in between all of them because, as like Jeff Rickley from the band Thursday, who's a big person in my book, he says really well how like in those years, the late 90s, geography wise, New Jersey was like this hub where touring bands could kind of like set up shop there, stay in Jersey and come through and also hit, on the way up DC, New York City, maybe, Long Island, Philadelphia, Boston, not that far away. So New Jersey really was like the central hub in this era of punk rock, right before the internet kind of expanded the world in the new millennium.
Here's me being a major history nerd. We could go back to like the American Revolution and people talk about New Jersey as a keg
Hmm.
tapped at both ends, right? Because it's got New York and it's got Philly and people are traversing
Yeah.
that corridor. So we'll bring that even into emo's growth.
Yeah,
Um,
I was a history major myself, and I recently watched Ken Burns' Revolutionary War, so you're bringing that back. I love it.
So not only is the geography important, I was struck by the way that the physical spaces where people were performing comes up again and again. And it's like these dank basements and VFW halls and small clubs. How important were those physical spaces to the band's development and to the relationships that they established with their audiences?
Yeah, and it's funny because you mentioned like the VFW halls, like Elks Lodges. None of this stuff was ever built with like emo or punk rock or really like even music in mind. These buildings probably go back to the early 20th century, Elks clubs, like these fraternal hangouts for people, a lot of which were immigrants who had like come over not that long ago. And then as the generations pass, like their grandkids are putting on shows there because like there's nowhere else really for kids starting their own bands, right? Because we're talking about an era where like Giuliani comes in and he's just on this like hard ass mission to like clean up the city. So like he's shutting down a lot of venues and a lot of this punk rock culture is coming into New Jersey. And, you know, what's just like so powerful about punk rock in general, but this scene, especially is because it was just like no one, no parent needs to sign a permission slip or give you like permission to go out and start a band. Like you and your friends or could just start a band or start any kind of project. And these spaces like VFW halls are just someone's basement. If a Rutgers college house where these houses that were built to house so many people, so the houses are really wide and they have huge basements, enough room to put on like a show. No one really needed to give these kids permission. They were just able to like go out and do it. So, it's kind of like rent a PA from Guitar Center or whatever. There's hardly any cost overhead. And, stay on time, make sure no one's band goes too over and ruins everything for everyone. But, probably bands are traveling from other places. So, you got to be a little bit mindful of that. And, that's how you build a scene. And yeah, it's really, really interesting how these spaces that were not meant at all for punk rock or even music came to foster a scene that blew up so big like this. Like there's one picture in the center of the book, which I have right here of My Chemical Romance. Um, from Ricky Saporta, who I interviewed a bunch from my book. He should honestly like I'm holding it up now. It's you can see Mikey from MCR and Frank from MCR just playing in a basement with like kids just like standing around in the basement watching them. And it's like freaking My Chemical Romance literally 2 years before they're on TRL. Like 2 years. So funny. And you can see like all the wires up like in the basement of the house and like probably like the smoke detectors and those like in like little industrial things up there. It's so wild. So wild.
Well, like in college, I would have wanted to be there, but now that I'm an old, boring mom lady, I'm just like, fire hazard, fire hazard. Thinking about potential catastrophe, but we'll put that aside for now. Um, you know, as you've mentioned, many of these bands come out of punk and hardcore, but they really lean heavily into songwriting that is so confessional, so narrative, so emotional, right? Obviously. Um, how does emo fit into a longer American tradition of confessional songwriting? And maybe that means Bruce, or maybe, any artists who really use their songwriting as a confessional tool.
Yeah, it's funny because so often, I've been interviewing like quote unquote emo bands since like, probably the early 2010s. And it's so funny how like such a line I hear all the time is like, "Well, why do they call our band emo? Like I thought all music was emotional." And it's funny because like back in the early like back then, like 15, 20 years ago, before like emo was kind of like reclaimed, and like before back then it was like still like really soon after this boom in my book had kind of fizzled out, and it was like too soon, and everyone was still kind of like, oh my God, I don't want to be labeled an emo band. But a lot of people have these bands have come around to being called emo since then. But yeah, it's that line I always hear is like, I thought all music was emotional, and it's like, of course, yes. But I'll go back to like kind of how we were talking about like punk rock and how I would define emo in the beginning of this. Punk is an especially emotional genre, and but with hardcore in a lot of ways, like it was very political. It was just so aggro and in your face because in a lot of ways it had to be back then. And emo when it started, like for people like just singing these cathartic or saying screaming these cathartic songs on like guys in hardcore bands or anyone in hardcore bands like screaming about their feelings and sobbing on stage. Like it was like, I mean, I wasn't there, in the 80s for this stuff when it started, but it was like wild back then, like bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace, and kind of like, even though the stuff that got huge in my book doesn't sound anything like that, it's still just this really extreme version in a way of punk rock that like puts personal emotions and like all kinds of emotions in the center, and like it's so driven by that like emotional core, which like obviously there's just so many fascinating songwriters in this genre who've like plumbs the depths of their emotions into their songwriting and just like kind of like bled all over the pages, so to speak. Yeah, it's a lot of phenomenal songwriters, and it's one of those paradoxes where, yeah, all music is emotional, but this kind of rock music is emotional in a special way, I guess you could say.
Was the phrase emo meant to be like an insult at first? You've talked about how some of the artists struggle with that title, and maybe they've now embraced it. Was it meant to be like, oh, sick burn? Like,
So even like so I really got into this in like 02, 03 was like my core years, like early high school, like really, really getting like super into the scene. Even back then, basically no band would just say we're an emo band. Like no one would. They would say like we're like post-hardcore. That the bands would say that a lot. They would say we're a punk band. They would say like, oh, we're like kind of punk and indie rock. We're kind of pop punk. Some would like sort of like say like we're emo, but in a jokey way. It was absolutely like kind of like some side eye if you were calling a band emo back then. It honestly, like in the like earlier than that in the 90s, it was even more of like a heavier like actual insult. But then as like the years gone by, like many things do, the stigmas around it fell off, for the better. And it's funny because now I just like when I just go through like these like re-listening to I was re-listening to a bunch of these bands on Spotify today. It's like get in the mindset for chat, and like basically all of them in their little bios that pop up in the bottom like right hand corner of Spotify. Basically all of them in their bios have the word emo in the first line. Even like bands like My Chemical Romance and Paramore, like the big bands of the genre who like tried to just be like rock bands, quote unquote, and like didn't like being called emo back then. Like they all came around.
now, is that because they are sincerely embracing vulnerability and emotion, or is it because emo became marketable?
It's a little of both. I mean, I think having the word emo does help you get on one of those big nostalgia tours or one of those big nostalgia festivals to play to millennials like myself. But like I said, like at the MCR concerts, and not just millennials who come out. Um, but yeah, no, I think like again, like it's sort of like growing up and like once you get to a certain age and you're not 17 anymore and you're not like hyper aware of what everyone thinks of you and you're not as like crazy in your own head as you used to be and like once you grow up a little bit, you're like, yeah, we were part of a scene. The word emo, maybe there was some stigmas back then. Maybe we wanted to just be called a rock band or whatever. But now, in the year 2020, whatever, you can look back and say, like, it meant something to a lot of people. It means something now. And, waving the flag of emo, maybe just because it has the word emotional in it. And that's exciting to a lot of people, younger people who are in their feelings getting into it. But I think, as you get older, I think you become at peace with a lot of things. And, you become a little bit more comfortable with yourself and you're like, you know what? Emo meant a lot of important things to a lot of people. So figured like, let's own this.
Very cool. So before the audience joined us, we were just kind of chatting, Chris, and I noted that I'm a huge advocate of oral history. I actually teach a semester-long oral history class here at the university. For you as an author, why go that route? Why do an oral history of emo versus just a traditional text where you did the research and you wrote? Why did oral history speak to you?
Well, I love reading oral histories and I always say, write the thing. Whoop, I'm dropping my headphones here. I always say, write the thing that you want to read, write the thing you wish you could read. And I really, really love reading oral histories. I love feeling like you're sitting around with all these rock stars and the less famous people who spent a lot of time around the rock stars, because those are often the people who have the most interesting stories, because those are the people who will talk more. Yeah, I love the format, and basically what inspired me to write the book was I read Meet Me in the Bathroom, which is Lizzie Goodman's oral history of downtown New York City and the Strokes, that early 2000s indie rock scene in New York City. I read that when it came out, I believe it was 2017, when I was a staff writer at Billboard. And I got super into that book, and it inspired me to do article oral histories for the Billboard website. So, like, basically, kind of like individual chapters that wound up being in my book. One was about the 2005 Warped Tour, and one was about the rise of Panic at the Disco and their first album and how they came out of nowhere. So that got me really into oral history, and I just love interviewing people. It's like I love so many parts of being a writer and editor, but as the years have passed, like 15 years doing this, like interviewing people is my number one. So having, exciting conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, just you know, eye-opening conversations, just chatting with interesting people, that's it. Like chatting with interesting people is what it's all about for me more than anything. And, I reread it today to make sure I had this right. I spoke to 150 people for this book, which is insane. So yeah, I really like interviewing people.
150, that's awesome. I love your note on enjoying interviewing the less famous people. I always say that. Like, I don't want to interview somebody who's been interviewed 300 times already in every outlet all over the world. I want to find those, little stories, those little nuggets that have been hidden. I'm curious, 150 people, that's a lot of interviews. Did you find that most people, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but were most people eager to speak with you, or did you have to do a lot of convincing?
Hmm. It's interesting. Some were eager, some took convincing. There were I probably can't, probably there were some who like acted like they were going to do it, and then just like people get busy with stuff, and like so many of these people I was getting in touch with them with just like messaging them on Facebook, or I would do an interview with someone, and at the end of the interview I'd be like, hey, would you be nice enough to like put me in touch with so and so. I know you're friendly with them. I would love to talk with them for the book. So I would do a lot of that as I wrapped up interviews. Yeah, I mean, like it's like Patrick Stump from Fall Out Boy. One of my I love talking to Patrick. that one just came, even though he's like one of like the biggest people in the book, that one just came so easily. Just like like from his manager, like, oh yeah, Patrick would love to talk to you. Just like the same day I interviewed, like asked his manager. Then there be like the people from behind the scenes, maybe from like the early days of building the scene in the 90s. It would be like messaging people on Facebook, and like when they got home from work, they'd maybe get back to you, and you'd be like talking to like an old hardcore guy, like after like he got his kids ready for bed and was like sitting there on like a Thursday night. Because I wrote this book during 2020, 2021, most of it. So this was like pandemic time. So like something that like I was really grateful for was how people were so like kind and open with their time during those years. Because as I'm sure everyone here remembers, it was scary. It was unprecedented times, and so many people were at home just like looking for things to do. And you know, for me, being able to chat with so many people about the past was it was a kind of an appropriate thing to do at that time when so many of us were confined to our homes and like reading old magazines we had saved from when we were a kid, or like listening to old CDs and vinyl you dug up and stuff like that.
I love that. A lot of people baked bread, you baked a book. That was very
Yeah.
productive use of your time. So, one thing I do find when doing oral histories about a particular subject or within a particular group is that sometimes memories conflict. Did
hmm
you encounter instances where memories conflicted, and how did you navigate that?
Um, let's see. I mean, for lighter stuff, I don't know if anyone watching saw the Michael Jordan documentary, like that came out on what is it, The Last Dance, I think it's called. It was really popular. The big Netflix Michael Jordan documentary that came out in like 2020, 2021. A thing they do with like a narrative device or to do the interviews in this documentary is like they'll interview someone like a rival, like Karl Malone from the Utah Jazz, and he'll say like what he thought about like a big game against Michael Jordan. Then they'll show the the video to Michael Jordan of like one of his rivals, basketball rivals, like, and then Michael Jordan will be like, "Oh, well, here's how I remember it. Yeah, in this game, like they were like really good on defense, and we knew we had to come at them this way." So what I did, I was kind of inspired by that. So what I did a lot in order to like jog people's memories and also add to the flow of the book in the interviews, I would interview someone, ask them a question, and then be like, "Oh, like Pete Wentz, I'd love to hear like what you remember of the VMAs in 2005." And to help jog your memory, like here I talked to Mikey from My Chemical Romance. Here, I'll read you the quote he said. So, to help jog his memory and transport him to that moment, read him the quote and then get, the response back. So a lot of that led to getting really good interlocking quotes on the page of the book, and it helped jog the memory because it's been a long time. It's interesting seeing how some just talking to so many people and seeing like how some people have just incredible memories for this stuff, how some people are kind of cataloging it as they go, then other people need a little bit of prodding. But yeah, I mean, I love history, so this stuff is also interesting to me, kind of setting the scene and whatever it takes to jog people's memories.
All right. So, as I noted, getting ready here with my colleagues to open a new museum. If a museum were to interpret emo, do an emo exhibit 20 years from now, what would be some of the biggest points that they should make in the exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, definitely highlighting like where it came from, like the DC punk scene in the mid '80s with like Discord Records, Ian MacKaye, all that important, all those bands. In the '90s they call it with emo, like it's some people listening and now probably have heard this a million times, but like they do it in waves with emo. So like the first wave was the DC stuff, and I'm paraphrasing here, but like the second wave was some of the most important ones were like Sunny Day Real Estate, their album Diary, American Football, their self-titled album that kind of started the whole like Midwest emo thing. My book is third wave emo, which is the popular stuff, probably the most widely recognizable and like the biggest triumph of mainstream emo. Black Parade is like safe to say, but Riot by Paramore. And other stuff like Thursday, Jimmy Eat World, also very important. And then like stuff that came later, like Title Fight, Modern Baseball, Tiger's Jaw. Um, yeah, I think it's really important to like highlight the entire history of emo as it comes till now. Yeah, still lots of good stuff out there. Cool Kids and a very good modern emo band whose album that came out last year I liked a lot. Yeah, and a lot of the good stuff is still coming from New Jersey. So it's I think with my favorite era is the stuff like a lot of people. My favorite era is the stuff that happened when I was in high school because when music hits you when you're like 16 years old, that's always going to be the best in a way. But I think there's great stuff above ground and below ground in the whole history of emo.
All right, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I am getting ready to open the floor to your questions. So find your unmute button. You can unmute yourself and shout out a question in just a moment, or you can type it in the chat and I would be happy to read it for you. So while you are formulating or typing your questions or looking for the unmute button, I'm going to ask Chris. Chris, you've rattled off some artists, some bands, some songs already this evening. But for folks here who are like, I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan, I don't listen to emo music,
Okay.
what are the top five artists or bands you recommend they go find to get a feel for this genre?
I mean, my all-time favorite band is Jimmy Eat World. Their song "The Middle," it's one of those songs that, like, even if you don't think you know it, you've heard it. It's like one of the catchiest rock songs ever written. It's one of the songs that brought emo from the underground to the mainstream because they had been an underground band for a long time before they broke it big. So yeah, Jimmy Eat World, Paramore for sure. My Chemical Romance, and to dig into some of like the earlier stuff, I would say American football, especially for people who if for people who are guitarists, I think American football, especially their self-titled debut album, that's and also within emo, it's super influential. But I think for guitarists, American would be a super interesting band if you've never dug into emo before. Um, and Yeah, from the 90s, trying to think of like another. There's so many great 90s emo bands, but Sunny Day Real Estate, they were one that came from Seattle kind of at the same time of grunge, and they have a lot of great albums, but their album Diary is like one of the classics of like 90s emo.
Well, there you have it, folks. From the expert, this is what you're gonna go. Get a feel for emo music if you're not familiar. Okay, so let's see what we've got in the chat. Dan asks, are there any stories you couldn't print or just didn't fit the mold of the book that you can share? And you can leave names out if that helps. But like, was there anything that you had to leave out of the book?
Yeah, I mean like the original like proposal of the book had like 70 chapters, and what is that? I think 37 is what I ended up with. So yeah, it was like so sprawling in like the original way I like pitched the book and like planned it out before I like kind of like started writing and realized, okay, to get a book under 500 pages, you can only cover so much. Um,
So basically, you have to cut half the book, is what you're saying.
yeah, I feel like a lot of the early version of the book had like a lot of like pop punk and more like Warped Tour stuff in it. I mean some stuff that like would have been more interesting to dig into is some of like the lore of My Chemical Romance and like the making of the Black Parade, going behind the curtain, so to speak. Mikey was like really generous with his time and like awesome to talk to. Um, but yeah, like that band is like obviously just like a well of inspiration and interestingness. You know, would have been like interesting to just like have even more MCR in the book. You know what I mean? Because there I feel like getting back to talking about like who has like a great memory and who is just like super eager to talk and who is like a little bit more like we let the music do the talking. For the big bands in the book, Fall Out Boy Pete, Patrick, and also like people around the band super, they're just like part of the reason they've gotten so big is they're so great at doing press and like working with the media. They can tell a story. There's so much great Fall Out Boy in the book. I like probably there could have even been so much more good Fall Out Boy stuff in the book, but to like balance them out with the other big bands like My Chemical Romance and Paramore, I had to like dial in how much Fall Out Boy there was because those guys just like wouldn't stop giving me good material.
Maybe you just do a Fallout Boy book in the future.
Maybe.
Here's a question in the chat from Steven. You mentioned the infancy of consumer internet usage in the late 90s, early 2000s. That corresponded with the sunsetting of a lot of independent, large format alternative FM stations and the onset of peer-to-peer file sharing. So, how important was early peer-to-peer file sharing with the mainstreaming of emo's music?
Yeah, I go into this a good deal in the book. One band that sticks out in particular is Dashboard Confessional. They were an acoustic emo band who came out of the South Florida scene. It was basically a one-man band, Chris Carrabba, who had played in a bunch of hardcore punk bands, but had just like a beautiful singer-songwriter voice and just wrote these very heartfelt, emotional acoustic love songs, which was like a radical thing to do back then. He would get like jeered at shows and he played with like punk bands and like people would like throw stuff at him. But anyway, like Dashboard Confessional in particular, why they got so big so fast and are one of like the bands that broke emo in like 99, 2000 was because a few people who they don't even know who they were in the early days of Napster put Dashboard Confessional songs, like stuff from their first album, Swiss Army Romance, put that stuff on Napster and it just spread like wildfire. And 2 years later, they did an MTV Unplugged session, the same famous, CD series that had like Nirvana, 1994 Unplugged and stuff like that, like Dashboard Confessional, who were just like this one guy from like the Miami hardcore punk scene 2 years later was in Times Square doing an MTV Unplugged, and like so much of that was based off of LimeWire. So yeah, like I think basically just about any underground artist who broke in the years of the late 90s and the early aughts, file sharing had a lot to do with it. But yeah, it's especially interesting for Dashboard Confessional. And like there's a lot of interesting stuff in the book about LimeWire, especially as it pertains to them. LimeWire and Napster and all that stuff.
Oh, good question, good answer. This is a question from Andrew in the chat. Did you record the interviews or take notes?
Oh wow. It would have been crazy if I took well, I yes, I recorded the interviews and then like went back over them and highlighted stuff that might be useful for the book and then like found the stuff that was definitely useful and built it chapter by chapter. Um, but yeah, as I'm going through an interview, I'm often like jotting down like, oh, come back to this, or ask about this, or like, oh wow, I didn't know this person is tight with this person and I really want to interview them. So like, like I was saying at the end of these interviews, I'd be like, hey, would you like be able to put me in touch with so and so? Let me talk to them because that's how you interview 150 people in a book. But yeah, so much like I was like talking about like being a journalist, historian, and interviewing people. It's almost like you're like, I don't know, maybe how I would imagine like an athlete playing where you're just like trying to just like stay so focused in the moment because when you're oftentimes when I'm interviewing people, I'm like obviously you're following what they're saying, you're following the conversation, but you have to be ready with like a follow-up question. If they say something like controversial, sometimes you want to maybe like check on something or, maybe call someone out on something or whatever. There's always like the next step in interviews. So yeah, taking notes. But like I said, I love interviewing people. It's hard, but it's really fun.
It's like emotionally draining, right? When you're done with the interview, you're like, whew.
Yeah.
Um, Here is a question in the chat from Eric. Do you feel that the term emo has transcended its origins as 80s emotional post-hardcore? It feels like it has been applied as a label across different genres and contexts now. So pop, folk, indie. Eric writes, even Bruce himself has been jokingly referred to as emo, partly because of Jersey Limit lineage, but also because he's very earnest, theatrical, and hands-on. There's also retroactive labels like country is farm emo. So has that label emo kind of exploded and just become part of pop culture jargon now?
Yes, that was a great question and great to bring that up because yeah, emo like this like it started happening like around the time the word started just being more accepted. It just started being like it could be like a sweater is emo or like shoes are emo. Like anything is like there's the emo lunch table at high school. I mean, well, back actually that goes back to like when I was in high school. But yeah, like it's just how these words evolve. It's most I mean, some people used to get like worked up about it. Like to me, it was mostly just kind of like entertaining and just like amusing to see how these things turn out because like we've been talking about get so precious about genre when it comes to music, especially like things like metal and punk, which are already subcultures. People get so precious about subcultures and genres within genres, and somewhat for good reason because it's their subcultures, they're things that people pour their lives into. But like with anything, you have to draw the line sometimes with how seriously you take it. And like, yeah, um, emo being used to describe like, Jimmy Butler when he got that crazy haircut with like the Miami Heat player, when he got like the Pete Wentz haircut a few years ago. Like, there's been all these like funny applications of emo, but like something like that's actually like also like kind of accurate is how like with emo being applied to rap, like someone can make a good argument like the biggest emo artists of the 2010s were emo rappers like, Juice WRLD, Lil Peep, XXXTentacion, because like, I was working at Billboard and in my 20s when this stuff was popping, but like from what I could tell, this was in a lot of ways like the kids who were into this was the same kind of kids who would have been into like MCR in 2004. There was a lot of parallels to that. And like sadly, all three of those artists died way too young. And I wonder a lot about like what music they could have made. It's a sad thing, sorry to take that question in a dark detour, but like, yeah, emo is especially like when I was like pitching the book and working on the book, emo in like the late 2010s and 2020s as it moved into other genres like hip hop. It's there's a lot to say about it. And I think it just speaks to like how interesting and how much like weight the genre has. Like, just coming out of a very specific kind of like regional punk in the 80s, like how far it's gone.
Yeah, it's just like this whole cultural phenomenon. I can't stop laughing at farm emo. Um, did anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question? I've been so busy reading questions in the chat. If you want to unmute, please feel free to do that and shout your question out, or you can keep typing them. Um, Here's a question, and I'm not familiar with this term, Chris. So if you are, great. If not, that's fine. Any thoughts on the genre of org core, sometimes known as beard punk or heartland punk, like Hot Water Music, Gaslight Anthem? Is it considered a cousin?
Okay, so whoever
Explain
asked that
this
question,
to us.
yes. This is specifically to whoever asked that question because I know it's up. I was at the Hot Water Music reunion uh, at Starland Ballroom in 2007 with Lawrence Arms opening. So yes, I do enjoy Orgcore. Yes. For everyone else, it's kind of like it's similar to emo. It's like a cousin. I mean, some bands who people put in with it or like I don't know, maybe kind of like a scruffier, more beardy, more like beer drinking cousin of emo, but it's still like punk rock. Because like I would think of like I know we're getting really inside baseball here, but stuff like older stuff from the 90s like Jawbreaker and like Alkaline Trio from Chicago, stuff that kind of like is punk and like kind of has like more of an edge to it, but it's still like super like, I drink too much and I'm emotional and like it's like it's like this stereotype of orgcore is like a guy with a bunch of like nautical tattoos and a beard and flannel and like but to tie it back into everything that we're talking about, Gaslight Anthem are definitely a band I would call orgcore, and like they're buds with Bruce Springsteen. They've played and collaborated with Bruce a bunch of times, going back like the past 15 years. And to anyone who's maybe looking for like an emo adjacent album that connects to like Bruce Springsteen, if someone's like a just big Springsteen fan but is not into any of the music we've been talking about, Gaslight Anthem, band from New Brunswick, New Jersey, either of their first two albums are my personal favorites, but anything in their catalog is great. But Gaslight Anthem, their first album, Sink or Swim, and their second album, 59 Sound, just two like New Jersey rock classics.
When you talk to these artists, did you have the opportunity to talk about their influences? Like, what was the music they grew up listening to?
Yeah, it's interesting because like most of, because most of these bands were starting or going in like the late 90s, early aughts. That's when they started. So it's a lot of people who like first started playing guitar in like the early mid 90s. So a lot like unless people are lying, most of them didn't start with like playing underground underground punk stuff. A lot of it was like Metallica, the Black Album. A lot of it was Nirvana. For maybe just like other thrash stuff like Slayer. Probably, the Beatles. It's just like, and then you get some more like more popular alternative stuff like The Cure and things like that. That stuff comes up. But yeah, I think like, for people coming up in this era, and also like especially Green Day and Blink-182. It's funny those bands haven't come up yet because like those two bands were so big for the emo boom happening in like 99 through '08. Uh uh Dookie, the album from Green Day, which basically broke pop punk, and then Blink-182 coming in the late 90s. Like, even though they're like, again, kind of on the periphery of emo, they're on like the pop punk side, but they absolutely paved the way for Fall Out Boy, Paramore, all that stuff.
Here is a question from Ian. When you were working at Billboard, as you mentioned, the term emo was often derided, and critically, many of the bands were never reviewed well. What was it like working there being the quote emo guy?
It was interesting because I started on staff in January of 2013, and emo was doing big things in like the top 40 pop world and also like in the underground because like this basically the same month I started, January 2013, was when Fall Out Boy came back from hiatus. They did that song, I know what you're I know my songs know what you did in the dark. That was their big comeback hit song. They did their album Save Rock and Roll after being away for a few years. Fall Out Boy were big on the radio again. Panic at the Disco came back with a big album a few years later. Paramore did Ain't It Fun and Still Into You. Their biggest hit song. Ain't It Fun came out in 2013, and I interviewed Haley for like one of my first big Billboard magazine interviews. But also at that time, which like I wasn't super aware of yet, was like a lot of this like 2010s emo revival stuff was happening, like Title Fight, Turnover, Algernon, The World is a Beautiful Place. In the early 2010s, like honestly, because I was so into emo as a kid, and I was just like starting at Billboard and trying to like broaden my horizons for my job and like listen to a lot of pop and a lot of rap. I wasn't as like into what was going on in like the punk underground. But then as like a few years went by of like being the rock guy at Billboard, I started to get into some more like the emo revival stuff. And like one that really sticks out is Turnover, their album that came out. Like I got to like interview them around their album Peripheral Vision, which is one of my favorite emo revival albums. That's it was it was in short, it was very fun being the emo guy at Billboard. It led to this book. A lot of interesting emo things. Like we were saying with like the rap stuff, like emo rap in the 2010s. It was really interesting to like see all that stuff happen from like a very like mainstream publication, like being the person who could kind of explain all this weird emo stuff to people.
Well, this has been awesome, Chris. Everybody had great questions. We are almost out of time. And as I noted, I keep it very, very on schedule. I don't like to go over an hour. But, Chris, I want to give you the last word. Is there anything we have not covered today that you would like to?
No, I think like thanks to everyone so much for showing up and everyone's questions. For anyone who's checked out the book, I appreciate it so much. Yeah, like like a lot of like what made me want to write the book was to like tell stories that hadn't been told yet because this genre has so many like obsessive fans who have read everything. So, when I was doing these interviews, I really made it a point to like ask things like that I knew you couldn't find just like by reading the Wikipedia page or like by reading an article in Rolling Stone from 2006 or something. So, I really wanted to make a book where I feel like people who are into this stuff, you can there's a lot of stuff you haven't heard before, stories that are in this. And if you're new to it, then I'd like to think it's a great way in. But yeah, if people want to, they can follow me on socials. My handle is C Payne on a plane on basically every platform that you could think of. I post there a lot about music, about the book, about other stuff I might have coming up. So yeah, just like yeah, thank you to anyone who's picked up the book or suggested the book. And like, yeah, I'm just so grateful for all stuff like this. This stuff changed my life. And like growing up in New Jersey, around this stuff is like, thinking like from a historical perspective, like looking back now, it's like, wow, I got to like grow up at such an interesting time around this music in New Jersey, and it's really special.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Everybody stick with me for 90 more seconds because I want to remind you, go out and get Chris's book, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008. And to keep in touch with us at the Springsteen Center for American Music. Again, our website is springsteencenter.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all that good stuff. We want to keep in touch with you. So we've got lots of exciting stuff coming up this year with the opening of our new building just in time for America's 250th birthday. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you are of a certain age, like Chris and I, we hope this brought you back and got you in touch with your angsty teen. And if you aren't familiar with the genre, we hope that you learned something new and that you're going to get out there and try some of Chris's recommendations on Spotify. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night.